anyone listened to the daf last night, it was a complicated daf because it had a lot of measurements of the Beit HaMikdash, which are confusing when you do them abstractly, unless you like numbers a lot. And I can't summarize it all. But the bottom line is that the pasuk in Yecheskel, which is where we took our lead from, has this interesting concept where it talks about when you build the mizbeach, you make an amma that's an amma v'tofach, an amma and basically a tefach, meaning it's a little bit bigger. It's not a little bit; it's a tefach bigger than the regular amma. So imagine an amma is then viewed as being 5 tefachim. This amma was 6 tefachim, which is 20% or 25% bigger, 20%, I guess. Um, and that the machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda was where we use that amma, right? Where do you use a 5 tefach amma and where do you use a 6 tefach amma, which of course has a big difference, right? If a tefach, sorry, is I don't know 3 inches or something, then no, it's a machloket how big a tefach is. But let's just say it's up to that size. Then obviously, if you add a tefach or subtract a tefach, you're going to make a significant difference in the height of the mizbeach, for example, or the width of the mizbeach, and that was the machloket all yesterday. Today.
I just found it surprising that they rely on Yeheskel, whose dimensions of the Har Habayit and whose descriptions of the Korbanot seem
Right.
to be completely different from what's in the Chumash.
Yeah, it's a really really good point. Obviously Yecheskel describes things that are as the rabbis interpret, for a new Beit HaMikdash, not the one we have. But on the other hand, there are many places in Yecheskel where there's many details that we rely on. Like you said, right? We've had many others when we talk about the Kohanim's function. Right? Yecheskel describes something so different in many ways, but when it's similar, we rely on it. So I agree. It's an interesting thing, but it's the only source we sort of have, so we use it. Um, Today's Gemara, though, goes to the next topic, which is we are up to, let me find the place on my online Gemara. We are up to one, two, sorry. No, I'm the wrong daf. Give me 1 second. That would have been bad. Okay, where today's daf in Masechet Menachot is daf 98, Sadi Chet, and we are up to 7 lines from the top. So in the Mishnah, right, we said that basically the Amma, well, let's get to it. So we talked about this Amma, we call it an Amma Benonit, right? So there's a small Amma, which is 5 tefachim. How big is an Amma Benonit, right? Says the Gemara now, Kama Amma Benonit, Amma Rabbi Yochanan, Shishat tefachim. The Amma Beinonit, the middle Amma, now we're going to see in a second, if it's a middle, it means there's one that's bigger than it, and obviously one that's smaller than it. What is the middle-sized Amma that they use in the Beit HaMikdash? Yochanan says it's 6 tefachim. Says Rabbi Yossi Bar Avin, our Mishnah is very clear about this, because Rabbi Meir says in the Mishnah, HaShulchan, remember Rabbi Meir said that the Shulchan was made with the middle-sized Amma, which was Arkosh Shnei Masar. He said it was 12, Rachbo Shisha, it was 12 by 6. The Pasuk says it's 2 Amot by 1 Amma. And Rabbi Meir translated that into Tfachim as being 12 by 6. So you see that each Amma of the Amma Benonit is 6. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it was smaller. It was 10 by 5. But according to Rabbi Meir, it is 12 by 6. It says Gemara, now I don't understand. What do you mean Amma Benonit? What Amma is bigger? We've heard about Amma of 5 tefachim and Amma of 6 tefachim, but if you call it a middle, it's not big and small, it's middle. So what's bigger? It implies that there's an Amma that's larger than 6 tefachim. Says Gemara, says Gemara, the answer is yes. As the Mishnah says in Mesechet Kelim, Shtei Amot hayu b'Shushan Habira. They had 2 Amot that were like the fixed, like the kilogram that they have wherever they have the kilogram, or a yard or a meter. You had a fixed standard in a place called Shushan Habira, which of course is not in Shushan Habira. It was in a section of the Beit HaMikdash that was named Shushan Habira. And the Gemara is going to talk later today why we had a section in the Beit HaMikdash named Shushan Habira. But these 2 Amot, Achat al Kerem Mizrachit Tzfonit, one was the northwestern Amma, meaning that's where northeastern Amma, V'achat al Keren Mizrachit Dromit, and one was on the southeastern side. So they had one on the south and one on the north, and obviously each one had its place. Shal Keren Mizrachit Tzfonit, the one in the north, the northeast, Yitera Shal Moshe Chatzi Etzba. It was half a finger larger than Moshe's Amma. So it was a tiny bit, a couple, maybe an inch or even less than an inch, like a centimeter larger than Moshe's Amma, and the one Shalkarim Mizrachit Dromit Chatzi Etzba. It was actually another half an etzba more than the first one, meaning it was a full etzba. Nimsa Yitera Shal Moshe Etzba. So basically, they had two amot that were not the right size. They were an amma plus a tiny bit or plus two tiny bits. Ask the Mishnah why. Lama amru achak delav achak tana. Why they have these two additional ones that were larger, one a little bit larger, one a lot larger than the regular amma. The reason is that we always wanted when people gave money or gave things to Hektish, that basically Hektish would have to get the advantage. The worry was that if you measured exactly and you got it wrong, you'd be stealing from Hektish, right? Hektish would pay you $1,000 for, I don't know, a curtain, and you came and you gave the exact size, but it was a smidge too small. And it turns out that you're taking Me'ilah or you're stealing from Hektish. So therefore, we always wanted, and this was the deal. You knew if you're doing business with Hektish, you basically are going to lose a little bit on the side. And so they would measure with this, I'd say, generous Amma in order for Hektish not to basically, a person not to get cheated or Hektish not to lose money. So Kadesh Yehi Ha'umanin, the workers, Notlin Baktana, when they took money from Hektish, they would use the smaller Amma, meaning the regular sized Amma, Umachzirin Bigdola. So they would return, and say you said to Hektish and said, I want to buy your extra curtains or something, right? So you would buy, I keep using that example, but let's just say I want to buy a yard or a meter or whatever, or an amma, right? So you would take exactly an amma of the regular amma, but when you went to Hektish and you sold to them, you would give them a larger share. Kadesh lo yavo lidei mi'ila. And it wouldn't come to Mi'ilah. Says, well, okay, so you need a tiny bit extra, right? This is a generous amma. But why do you need two of them? Tarti lamali, why do you need one that's half an etzba and one that's a full etzba, bigger than regular amma? And just remember, because it depends on how expensive the item is. Chara the kasma v'dava. One is when you're measuring things that are made out of silver and gold, which are incredibly valuable, and obviously a very, very small amount of extra silver or gold would be catastrophic in terms of cost. So no one would do business with Hektish if they were going to lose all that money. So they used a very small addition, half of etzba. But chada lebinyana, when you're talking about building, like wood or my example, the cloth or things like that, you use a slightly larger shear just to be safe. So that was why the regular amma, which is six tvachim according to Rabbi Meir and five according to, six according to Rabbi Meir, according to everybody really, but Rabbi Meir in the Shulchan it was six, is called the amma beinonit. Now, while we're on the topic that they had these measurements hanging in Shushan HaBirah, we quote the Mishnah in Midot. It's not Hatam. The Mishnah says in the beginning of Masechet Midot, Sha'ar Mizrach, on the eastern gate of the Azara, above Shushan HaBirah Tzura, there was a picture of Shushan HaBirah. They had a beautiful drawing, a mural of Shushan HaBirah. And that's why the area that we just said in the Mishnah was called Shushan HaBirah. It says more why, right? My time. Why in the world? Obviously, this is in the second Beit HaMikdash. In the first Beit HaMikdash, there was no Shushan HaBirah yet. There's not no Jewish connection. So why do they have a picture of Shushan on top of the eastern gate of the Beit HaMikdash? So Rav Chisda, Rav Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, Chad Amar, one said, "Kadei sheyedu mehechon ba'u." Look, the Jews when they went to exile, they ended up in Shushan. Obviously, we know the whole story from the Megillah. We know where the Jewish community grew, Mordechai, Esther, whatever the whole story, and therefore excuse me, when they came back successfully to the Beit HaMikdash, they wanted to have a reminder of where they came from, which is a very interesting concept, right? And obviously, an idea both how far we've come and things like that. But the other explanation is Kadesh emat malchut aleihem, that in fact it was there maybe because they had to have it, maybe it was enforced on them by the Persians or the Americans or the equivalent, that they had to have a picture of Persia there or Shushan so you would remember where the power comes from. And so that is a little more ominous explanation for why they had Shushan HaBirah in the Beit HaMikdash, which again, very relevant for any Jews coming back from exile. So that is the machloket. We don't know who said what, but says Rabbi Yanai, I'm Rabbi Yanai on this topic, no matter how independent you want to be or how independent you think you are, if there's a king, if there's a melech, whether it's a melech of your country or the world or a dominant king, you should have fear. Don't flaunt and don't treat them lightly. Shenemar, as it says, Moshe says to Paro, when he's talking about, I'm gonna do one more makkah, and you're all gonna want to leave. You're gonna come to beg me to leave. So Moshe says, "Yardu kol avadecha ela alai mishtachavuli lemar." Right, all of your servants will come and bow down to me to ask me to leave. Now, the truth is, what he was really saying was that Paro would come, but he didn't want to say that because it wasn't respectful to say that Paro would come and bow down to him. So he said, "Your servants." He didn't say you, even though that was the case. So you see that even then, when Moshe, of course, is powerful and he's going to get out of Mitzrayim, he spoke in a way that was respectful of the Melech. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mehacha. Rabbi Yochanan says I had a different source for that. Shenemar, as it says, it's a very interesting pasuk when it talks about after Eliyahu fought with Achav, right, and he basically overcame the Nivi'ei Habal. It says, "Vayad Hashem hayta al Eliyahu." The spirit of Hashem, the hand of Hashem was on Eliyahu. Vayishanes matnav. He tied he tied his pants up. Veyaratz lefnei Achav ad ba'acha Yisraela, and he ran in front of Achav. He basically was a herald in front of Achav until they got to Yisraela, even though, of course, Achav was very wicked, but it was still respectful for Eliyahu to be in front of him and to show cover to the king. So that is a reinforcement of this message. Now, another,
A
sorry?
question. Yeah, question.
Yes, go ahead.
So by the time this was written, and for the last about 300 years of the Second Temple, Shushan was not the capital anymore. They moved it to Ctesiphon, which is not mentioned much in the Talmud, um, which is near modern Baghdad.
I can't speak to the history. I trust you on that because I don't know. But I mean, I certainly in our literature, Shushan obviously had a very, very outsized, influence on the Jewish experience in Bavel. It's what we know about. So it could just be historical, right? That's what they sort of remember. They had the Megillat Esther, presumably. But yes, I don't know exactly. It's the same thing, today you think you put a picture of Rome, which obviously hasn't been a factor in our lives for 2,000 years, but I don't know exactly. Thanks for the history. Anyways, continues the Gemara now. We're two dots around 10 lines from the wide lines. And we're quoting this mainly because it's a machloket between the same two people, Rav Chisda and Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. So the pasuk says in Yecheskel, another pasuk in Yecheskel, beautiful pasuk at the end of Yecheskel, that talks about in Latid Lavo, there's going to be this tremendous outpouring from the Beit HaMikdash, and there's going to be a river that flows out of the Beit Kodesh HaKodashim. It's an incredible story, right? And the river goes down, and the pasuk describes where the river goes, and it goes down the hill, and there's fruits on it, et cetera, et cetera. And it says, Va'aleo l'trufa, and the fruits are going to grow on this river, and the leaves of the fruit are going to be healing. So what does that mean? The leaves will be for healing. Rav Chisda, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Chad Amar Lahatir Peshel Mala. One said trufa comes from the word, it's a nutrikan, it's a combination of the word hitir peh, opened up the mouth. What does open up the mouth mean? So one says that mouth means your physical mouth. Others say it means your genitals, basically, which is an opening. So chad amar lahatir peshelam mala, your mouth, right? The chad amar lahatir peshelam mata. One says it's to open the mouth below, meaning to let's read inside. It's mar. Chisia said one said lahatir pe ilmim, that those who are mute will be able to speak. And bar kaparam lahatir pe akarot. It's for those who are unable to bear children because their womb is closed, will become opened in Lati Lavo with this sort of magical water and fruit that comes out from the Beit HaMikdash. Now back to our sugya. Tanur Abanan says the Braita, when the Torah describes the lechem hapanim, which we've been describing the whole time and how you set up the shulchan, it says v'lakachta solet, take flour, afitoto, shteimes chalot, so it says make 12 bread, samta otam shtayim marachot, put them in two marachot. Marachot are arrangements, like two lines, basically. Lo nemar sheish, right? It doesn't say the word six. Right? Sorry, it does say the word six. It says, I take it back. The Braita says, if it had just said what I just read, but it didn't say sheish lemarechet, which is what the pasuk actually says, put six on each side. Hayiti Omer, I would have thought, look, you have to have 12 in two piles, but they don't have to be equal. So you could have said achat shel arba v'achat shel shmona. You could have had one pile of 4 and one pile of 8. Lekach nemer sheish. Therefore, it says sheish lemarechet, 6 on each side. Now it says if ilu nemer shtayim arachot sheish lemarechet, so maybe you could just say have two arrangements, 6 on each side. What do you have to tell me 12? I can do the math. 6 times 2 is 12. If it had not said lo nemer shtei mesrei, hadn't explicitly said that you have to have 12 chalot, Hayidomer, you know what I would have said? I would have said that it just says 2, but you can have more than 2, right? I would have said, or you have to have more than 2. I think I would have said shalosh shel sheish. I would have said that basically the pasuk is saying 2 marachot of 6 plus 6 in a marechet, right? Meaning 3 marachot, which is 18. Therefore, the pasuk says you have to have 12 chalot. And the third part, ilu nemar 12 chalot umarachot, right? If it had said you should have 12 chalot in arrangements, in marachot, v'lo nemar shtayim v'sheish, and it didn't say two marachot or six in each marachet. I would have said, look, you have to have piles, but they don't necessarily have to be two piles. I would have thought you could have three piles or four piles. Shalosh arba arba. You have three of four in each one, or potentially even more. Lekach nemer shtayim v'sheish. So therefore, we learn from these three psukim Ad shelo yomru shlosha mikrot halalu lamanu. If you didn't have all three of these psukim, meaning the word shtemasrei, 12, shtayim, that you have to have two of the marachot, and six in each marechet, I wouldn't have known everything. HaKetzad, so now let's lay it all out, which is of course why we're quoting this. Says Gemara, how in fact did the Shulchan look? Noten shtayim marachot shel shesh. You had two marachot of 6, 6. So that was what you're supposed, six chalot on one side, six chalot on the other side. We're not going to go through, of course, last week's stuff of what the chalot looked like, right? Because that was very complicated. But they six on each side. Um, so says the Mishnah, the Braita, sorry. I mean, Natan achat shel arba v'achat shel shmona. Now, if you do it wrong and you stack up four on one side and eight on the other side, then lo yatza. Then you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of properly doing it the way the pasuk describes. But what happens if you do shtayim shel sheva sheva? What if you do six and six on each side, but you add one? So you didn't have too little on either side, and they're equal, but you have seven. So the question is that seventh going to ruin the whole thing, or not? Rebbe says it doesn't actually ruin it, because roinet al yonak ilo eno. Just look at the top one as if it's not there. You put six that were correct. You added a seventh on top. You made a mistake. You thought you're doing better by doing more. You're not. But we just ignore it. It doesn't ruin the whole thing, right? In this theoretical case. Says the Gemara, well, that's interesting. Maybe you can imagine it's not there. But the fact is, you have to put the bezichem, right, of the levona, of the spices on top of the bread. And if you put it on top of the seventh one, then basically you're putting it on the wrong place. It's supposed to be on the sixth one. Ask the Mishnah, ask the Gemara, right, sorry, Vaba'inan v'natata al, right? It says tata al levona zaka al marechet, right? You should place the levona zaka on the marechet. Amar Rabbi Chisda, Rav Hamnuna says Rav Chisda to Rav Hamnuna, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Rav Chisda, some say the opposite. Rebbe the Tameh. In fact, Rebbe is of the opinion to Amar al besamuch. Rebbe says al always means next to. Al does not literally mean, according to Rebbe, that something has to be sitting on top of the bread. So the reality is that even if it's not on top of it, it's next to it or near it because it's on top of another layer on top of it. That's considered to be close enough. The Tanya, we had this in Braita, we've quoted this before. Rebbe quotes the pasuk that we just read, V'natata al ha'ma'arechet levona zaka. You're supposed to place on the ma'arechet the levona zaka. Says Rebbe, it doesn't mean literally on. Al b'samuch. Al means nearby. Ask the Braita, or says the Braita, Ata omer al b'samuch inu ela al mamash. How do you know that al does not mean literal? Says Rebbe, Kishu Omer, it says by the Aron, Misakota al Haaron et haparochet, that you cover you put like a curtain, right, a sukkah of the on the aron of the parochet, but obviously the parochet is not on the aron. The parochet is in front of the aron. So haviomer al b'samuch. So you see from here that al does not mean on it literally; it means nearby. Okay, so that is Rebbe's opinion, and that's why Rebbe would say that this strange shulchan of 7 and 7 would be okay. Continues the Gemara now to 2.5 in the bottom. The Mishnah said, Kol HaKelim Shebemikdash, that they were oriented in a way that their length was to the length of the Beit HaMikdash, with the one exception, right? So again, I know it's hard to just abstract, and I don't have pictures, I apologize, but the Beit HaMikdash in Shlomo's Beit HaMikdash, which is the one we're using, not Yecheskel's, was 20 by 40. It was 20 by 60, right? So it was 20 amot wide. The whole house was 60 amot long. 20 by 20 of that was the Kodesh HaKodashim, and 20 by 40 of that was what we call the Kodesh, or the Heichal, right? And within the Heichal, there was the Mizbeach HaZahav, the Mizbeach HaKetoret, which is the Zahav, there was the Menorah, and there was the Shulchan, right? So now, so obviously the length of the house, of the Bayit, is the 40 Amot, which goes from the east to the west, or the west to the east, and the width is north-south, okay? So hopefully that's a little bit of orientation. Tanu Rabbanan, says the Braita, Kol HaKilim Shebemikdash Arkan Arko Shel Bayit. Right, every kli in the Beit HaMikdash, its length, was the length of the bayit. Meaning, for example, the shulchan, which was 2 by 1 amma, it would go in orientation where the 2 amot were east-west, which is the length of the bayit, and the one was north-south. Okay, So the way you would think about it, you're walking into the bayit, you're facing the longer side of the shulchan, the shorter side, but the length of the shulchan. Chutz mi aron. The only exception was the aron, which is of course in the Kodesh HaKadashim, she'arko l'rachbo shabayit. The aron, which was 2.5 by 1.5, right? On time mechetzi arko, of the Amma, no, two and a half by two, sorry, right? So the 2.5 of the Aron was facing the north-south orientation of the bayit. So the Aron, if you're facing it, you would actually be seeing the long side, the 2.5 Amma side, and that was the north-south part of the orientation. So that was the exception. Okay, where am I? Arko l'rachbo shel bayit. V'kach hayom munach, and that's how the Aron would sit. V'kach hayom badav munachim, and this is how its pillars, its badav, its poles that you held it with would sit. Now we don't know what any of that means. That's what are you talking about, right? Mike Amar, what are you saying? Hachik Amar, what we're saying is the proof and the way we know that the Aron would sit basically sideways in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Kodesh HaKadashim, was kacha yemunach. This is how it would sit, mid badav kacha yemunachim, because it's badav, I don't know how you translate badav in English, but the things you hold it with would sit that way, right? So the carrying parts, the badim, right? So because the badav were on the other orientation, right? So meaning the badav were on the short sides of the aron, and between the badav, so if you have a rectangle, sorry, there's on the short side, which is the two amot side, is where you would have the pillars, the poles, sorry, that you held it with. And so because of that, the aron had to go sideways because the badim had to stick out into the curtain that was facing the kodesh. Says, well, how do you know that? Ubadav Minalan. How do you know that the actual holding things, the badim, had to be on that side of the aron? The Tanya, because the Braita talks this way. It says the Braita. It says Vayarichu habadim. This is talking about in Melachim. It says the badim were long, and you were able to see them that you could see them from the Kodesh, but you couldn't see them outside. The pasuk says the Braita when it describes the badim, you might think that they didn't actually touch the curtain. They went up to the curtain outside of the Kodesh, Kodesh Kodashim. So it says that you could see them. If you can see them, you might think that they actually made a tear, a hole in the parochet and stuck out. That basically you would make a little indentation, not an indentation, make a little hole and let the badim come out of the parochet. You couldn't see them outside. Okay, so exactly how did the badim sit? So what they would do was, dochakim, turn to daf tzarichet amabet, they would take the badim, basically, the poles coming out of the aron, and they would go up to the parochet, and they would go touching dochakim abotim ba-parochet, they would push the parochet, they looked like breasts, essentially, where you didn't see anything outside, but they were making an indentation, an impression on the parochet. So if you're standing on the outside, you would see these two indentations from the badim. Shnemar, and it's based on a pasuk in Shir Hashirim, which says, "Tzror hamar dodili bein shaddai yalin," that you lay between my shadaim, you lay between my breasts, which is a metaphor in this case for the aron, where the kruvim are, where the shochet, where the kodesh kodeshim is, that it sits between these two breasts that are made by the poles coming out of the aron. So that is how the aron sat, and because the poles were on the side of the aron, the long side of the aron, basically, it had to be sideways in the kodesh hakadashim. It says, well, how do you know that that's how the poles were put? Meaning, again, you have an aron that's 2.5 by two, right? And so you can either put the poles on the long side or the short side. How do you know? Minol and badav the putiyan aron havayatvi. Excuse me. How do you know that the badim that held the aron were put on the width of the aron, meaning that they were put 2.5 amot away from each other along the short side of the aron. Maybe you put them the other side of the aron. Maybe you put them in the length of the aron. Rav Yehuda, says Rav Yehuda, well, the issue is that when you carry the aron, think about it, right? There's two poles. Two Leviim, right, would stand in the middle to carry the aron. So they have to stand next to each other. Now, our assumption is that you would stand on the inside of the poles because that's more stable, I guess, right? If you're standing on the outside, it could slip off your shoulder and fall down. But if you're standing on the inside, so basically you would have two big poles, like imagine, when they carry those people through the streets, right? So they were carrying the aron. You have two people behind it and two people in front of it. And so the two people standing together have to stand shoulder to shoulder. And Trey Gavri, Ba'amta, the Palga, lo mistagile. If it was 1.5 amot, I keep saying two, but I mean 1.5. Right? So remember, the Aron was 2.5 by 1.5, right? So if your poles are between the short side of the Aron, so they're only 1.5 amot away from each other, two men, two grown adults cannot stand shoulder to shoulder in 1.5 amot, right? 1.5 amot might be, I don't know, almost 3 feet, but two people cannot stand there. And therefore, you needed to have the more generous space, which is the width of along the width, which is the equal to the length of the aron of 2.5 amot, so that the two people can walk and carry it. It says the Gemara, "Menolan to arba havidarle." How do you know you have to have four people carrying the aron? Because dichtiv, as it says, "Nasua kihatim." Nosei Hamikdash. So we read that pasuk, the katim or tray were two. Nosei Hamikdash nami tray. So you had to have four people carrying the aron, and therefore you had to have more space between it, and the aron would go sideways in the Beit Hamikdash, so that the badim would come straight out, and the two people on the front and two people on the back, could carry the aron. So now we've figured out, says our Mishnah, that everything in the Beit Hamikdash was going the length, right? So every long thing, which mainly meaning the shulchan and the mizbeach, we'll talk about, was going the lengthwise of the Beit Hamikdash, except for the aron, which was going sideways. Now, Taner Rabbana, let's try to keep analyzing this based on the psukim and Divrei Yamim, which describe some of the additions that Shlomo made to the Beit Hamikdash. Taner Rabbana, Asara Shulchanot Asa Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo, in addition to the Shulchan of Moshe, made 10 extra Shulchanot in the Beit Hamikdash. And Nemar Vayash Shulchanot Asara, it says in the pasuk in Divrei Yamim that Shlomo made 10 shulchanot. Vayanach behichal chamisham yamin chamisham mismol. He put five on the right and five on the left. Now, what do you mean five on the right and five on the left? In Tomar, if that means chamisham yamin hapetach, that when you come in the door, there's five tables on the right. The chamisham mismol hapetach and came matin shulchan b'darom, right? Then it turns out that five of those are on the south side and five are on the north. But HaTorah Amra Shulchan Titinot Tzelet Tzafon. The Torah says that the Shulchan has to be on the north side of the Azara, right, of the Kodesh, which is when you walk in, it's the right side. Okay. Ella, it means that not that there were five on the right of the door and five on the left of the door. Shel Moshe be'emtza. It means that there were five on the right of Moshe's Shulchan, chamisha mimino and chamisha mismolo. Okay, five on the right and five on the left. Now, we don't know yet how big these are, but we're going to ask in a few minutes. We assume that these shulchanot were made in a model of Moshe's shulchan. And so basically each one was 2 amot by 1 amma, which is a little tricky because if you have 10 of these and they're 2 amot each, then that's 20 amot. And that was the width of the entire, what's it called, Kodesh, right? Which obviously can't be the case because you're not allowed to have things on the south. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But before we get there, Tanur Rabbanan, there's another pasuk which says that Shlomo made 10 menorot. Eser menorot asa Shlomo, shenemar v'yaset ha-menorah zahav eser kamishpat, v'yitam tein b'heichal Moshe, Shlomo, sorry, put these in the heichal, chamisha mimin v'chamisha mismol, five on the right and five on the left. And again, says the Braita, im tomar, what do you mean five? What is five on the right and five on the left? Does that mean five on the side of the door when you walk in on the right? Chamisha mimina petach and chamisha mismola petach. Five on the right of the door and five on the left of the door. Imkei matzinu menorah b'tzafon. Then the five on the right are going to be in the north. Torah Omra. Torah says ta menorah nochacha shulchan, that the menorah has to be facing, meaning on the other side of the shulchan. And since we just said the shulchan was in the north, the menorah has to be in the south. Hello, it means the exact same thing. Shal Moshe be'emtza. The menorah of Moshe was in the middle. Chamisha mimina. There were five new menorot to its right, and chamisha mismola, and five on its left. Now it says the Braita, where were these extra shulchanot and extra menorot? So Tani Chada, one Braita says, "Mechatzi bayit ulifnim hayu munachim." They were halfway into the house and further in, meaning as you walk into the Kodesh, remember the Kodesh is 40 amot in Shlomo's bayit, and so you have to go 20 amot in, and then you start in the second 20 amot between the end of the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim is where you would place all these extra shulchanot and menorot, as well as the menorah and shulchan of Moshe. Tanichan, now there's another Braita which says, no, it's a third of the way in. Mishlish habayit ulifnim hayu menachim. They were a third of the way in and inward, but that's really the same opinion because depending on whether you count the Kodesh HaKodeshim in your total measurement, right? So remember, the Kodesh was 40, the whole area was 60. So if you count 40, it's halfway in because it's 20 amot in. If you count the 60, it's a third of the way in because that's also 20 amot in. Lokashia marka chasha beit Kodesh Kodeshim Bahadi Heichal. One opinion is just including the Kodesh Kodeshim as part of the length of the Heichal, meaning it's 60, and so it's a third of the way in. And Marco, look, Chashabet Kodesh Kodeshim Bahadi Heichal, and the other one is not including that, so it's half of 40. But either way, these started 20 amot in to the Azara, into the Heichal, sorry. Tanarabanan. Now says the Braita, where in the world were these extra shulchanot and menorot placed, right? So where did you put them? We are at the second to last narrow line. Where did you place these? So says Rebbe, Mizrach umarav hayum menachim, that these extra shulchanot were placed east to west, which means that the length of we do the shulchan, right? The shulchan is 2 amot by 1 amma. It says Rebbe, the 2 amot length of it was oriented west-east, which meaning if you're walking in, it's facing you basically, right? You're walking in from the east, you're going to, the other way. You're walking in from the east, you're going to the west, right? So the shulchan was basically length of the azara, which is also the length of the heichal. That's what Rebbe says, which is normally the way we do all the kelim. But Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Shimon says, no, I disagree. It's tzafon v'darom. They were placed basically sideways. They were placed north-south, so that if you walked in, you were facing the 2 amot of each table. By time of the Rebbe. Now, why did Rebbe say that they were facing east-west? Because Gamar mi menorah, he learns from the menorah. Just like the menorah was facing Mizrach u'Marav, was facing east-west. Af ha nami Mizrach u'Marav. The Shulchanot also were facing east-west. Says Gemara, how does he know about the menorah? A menorah gufa minalan. How does Rebbe know that the menorah was oriented east-west? And again, east-west means if you walk into the Beit HaMikdash and you see the menorah, you actually see one candle because you're facing a line where they're going towards the Kodesh Kodashim. If it was north-south, you'd be facing the face of the menorah and you'd see all 7 candles. How does Rebbe know that it was facing east-west? Because it says by Ner Maravi, it says by the most western Ner, Yarochoto Aaron Lifnei Hashem. Aaron puts it in front of Hashem, meaning that it's facing the Kodesh HaKodashim. Michlal dekulu lav lifnei Hashem implies that all the other candles were not facing in front of Hashem. Why? If you say that the menorah was in front of you and it was north-south, then every candle is just as close to the Kodesh HaKodashim as every other candle. Kulanami lifnei Hashem. So it must be that it was facing east-west, and so the candles got closer and closer to the Kodesh HaKodashim, and the most western candle was the Lifnei Hashem. So that is Rebbe's proof that the menorah was oriented in the east-west orientation. And so, and says Rebbe, so too the Shulchan would be the same way, just like the menorah. And Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Shimon, my time. Why does Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Shimon argue? He says, well, you're right that the menorah was facing north-south, sorry, east-west. But I'm learning from the Aron. We just proved that the Aron was facing the other way. That the Aron was oriented north-south. So I learned it from the Aron. Gamar me Aron. Ma Aron safon v'darom. Just like the Aron was facing north-south. Afha namit safon v'darom. Says the Gemara, okay, so basically you have a menorah that's one way, and Aron that's another way, and when we're trying to learn the Shulchan. So Rebbe Nami Ligmar me Aron. Rebbe, why don't you learn it from the Aron? He says, because it was something inside the Kodesh HaKodashim. Dana chutz michutz vein dana chutz mipnim. Learn something in the Heichal from something else in the Heichal, not chutz mipnim. So therefore, the Aron is not a good way to learn. Rebbe Elazar Shimon, why doesn't he learn from the menorah? Ligmar mi menorah. Where am I up to? Why doesn't Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon learn from the menorah, I guess, midway through the wide lines? Amar lecha, he would say to you, I disagree. I think the menorah itself was tzafon v'daram havi munach. The menorah itself was oriented in a tzafon daram, meaning in a face. You're basically walking facing the menorah. We said that the Ner Maravi was going lifnei Hashem, and according to you now, there's nothing that's actually closer to the Kodesh HaKodashim. Says Rebbe Elazar Rishimon, the mitzadi leit tzedudi. What it means is that you would actually lean the lamps towards the Kodesh HaKodashim, right? So basically, although the menorah was flat, was one layer, you could actually orient the cups so that the wick or the light from the cup was going towards the Kodesh HaKodashim for the one that was the Ner Maravi, which in this case might have not necessarily been the most western one, but it was the candle that was facing the Kodesh HaKodashim. The Tanya. Now we have a Braita that says that. It says El Mul Pnei HaMenorah Yi'ir Sheva Nerot. What does that mean? Melamed Shahayu Mitzadin Pneim Klapei Ner Hamtzai. It tells you that you orient all of the lamps towards the middle one. And the middle one would then go towards the Kodesh HaKodashim in the picture that Rashi has, which I think is, pretty accurate. Amar Rabbi Natan, says Rabbi Natan, Mikan, you see a lesson from here, this is good for all children, she'emtsa'i meshubach, that the middle child is the best. The middle thing is the best. And so that's what you see from here. That's good to be in the middle. So I don't know if anyone's a middle child, but Nava is. So Rashi actually, it's interesting. What does that really mean? MC Meshubach. Tosa says it's like this is the principle that whenever people are walking, right, the most respected person should be in the middle, right? You should flank that person. Or yeah, so Rashi is a different example, but that's what you see from here. Now, says the Gemara, let's just in the last few minutes of today's daf, let's try to wrap our heads without pictures, though many of you might have Gemaras that have pictures, of what this Heichal actually looked like, right? Because we think of the Heichal as being a very large, huge area, 20 by 40 amot, right? So very large ballroom with a shulchan, a menorah, and a mizbeach. It's sparse, it's beautiful, it's amazing. But all of a sudden, Shlomo now added 10 menorot and 10 shulchanot, and it starts getting the feeling like it's like, a living room that's full of couches kind of thing. Like where did everything even go? Right? So let's figure out logistics. And again, we're making the assumption that every shulchan, we're going to deal with the shulchanot only, every shulchan of Shlomo was the same size of the shulchan of Moshe. And remember, the Shulchan of Moshe was 2 by 1 amma. Okay, so and he has 10 of them. And so Bishlam Lamandam Mizrach Marav. I get that if everything was oriented Mizrach Marav, meaning that the two amot were lengthwise. So I understand that you could have 10 shulchanot, right? Because basically what happens is that you have from the midpoint of the Heichal, which is 20 amot in, to the Kodesh HaKodashim, which is 20 amot from you, you have a series of 10 tables. Each one is 2 amot long, and it goes 2 times 10 is 20. So you have 10 tables and 20 amot. Now we haven't talked yet about where Moshe's shulchan was, but the shulchanot of Shlomo made sense. Elamanda Tzafon v'Darom. But if you're going east-west, sorry, north-south, so then the shulchanot are side by side. 20 shulchanot, first of all, the whole width of the Beit HaMikdash was only 20 amot. So you can't fit 20 amot exactly in that space. There's going to be an inch or two that's extra, right? And there's walls on the side. How could you fit 10 shulchanot in 20 amot? And furthermore, think about it logistically. If you put a row of 10 tables that are 20 amot, then where do the Kohanim go, right? It's like a wall in the middle of the Beit HaMikdash. But two
They
Kohanim,
have to jump over them.
I'm sorry?
They'll have to jump over them.
Right. So where did the Kohanim go? And furthermore, obviously 5 of those are now in the south, right? Because if you're going the whole width of the Beit HaMikdash, then 5 are in the north and 5 are in the south, and you're not allowed to. And finally, the question is, and for sure, if you have 20 amot and you have to fit 11 tables, right? 10 you can squeeze in, but where do you get the 11th? The one of Moshe. Ulutamech says, well, you're right, but that's a problem no matter what you say. Because if you assume they're all in one line, even if you're going east to west, so sure, you don't have the problem of the north and you don't have the problem of where they stand. But where's Moshe's shulchan going to go? Alice says, Mar, you misunderstood this whole thing. It doesn't have to be one row. Mi savrit chad darahu havi trey dare havi. They could be in 2 rows. So basically, you don't have one row that's all side by side. You could have 2 rows, and Rashi gives a couple of beautiful pictures here of top of Daf Ten Amun Aleph, which is either north to south. I'm not sure which one's north south, but he has hands. I'm sure those are from the printer, obviously. But you can see the north-south orientation where you have basically 2 rows of 5 tables and Moshe's shulchan in the middle, or north-south where you have 2 rows of 5 tables, which each one is 2 amot. So they go for 10 amot, which is the whole side of the Beit HaMikdash that shulchan is supposed to be on. And Moshe's in the middle. So that's the explanation. So Mishnah says, well, that's a good answer. But where did the Kohanim walk? Right? And the problem, of course, is that we just said when we talked about the Aron, that in order to have 2 people come in and stand there, you need to have 2.5 amot. Okay? So So now, if you're going north, south, everything is good. Okay? Because if you look on the picture in Rashi, you can approach the Shulchan, you can walk around it, you go to the other side, you're very happy. Elamanda Amar Mizrachu Marav. But if you say that the Shulchan went Mizrach Marav, meaning you're walking into the Beit HaMikdash and you're seeing 2 long rows in front of you with Moshe's in the middle, then I don't understand how you arrange that in the width of the Beit HaMikdash. Because think about it this way: Kama mashuch, michli, shulchan kama mashuch min hakotel. How far does the shulchan have to be away from the wall so that you can walk next to the shulchan and put bread on it? Shnei amot umechza. It has to be 2.5 amot. Okay, so that's the shear that we said before. You get people to come in. One person takes out the bread, one person puts in the bread. So you need 2.5 amot on the side, meaning from the wall of the Beit Hamikdash to the shulchan is 2.5 amot, and then the shulchan itself is 1 amma. Right? That's the width. Shulchan where my amadide, and then on the other side you need another 2.5 amot. Right? Where my amadide ushte amot umechsa de beni beni. Um, Sorry, where am I? I'm on the fourth line, right? So you have to have 2.5 amot from the wall, and then 1 amma of the shulchan, and then another 2.5 amot between shulchan one and shulchan two, which is the shulchan of Moshe, right? Shtei amot umechza de beni beni, and then another amma of the shulchan of Moshe, and shtei amot umechza de beni beni, and then another 2.5 amot between the shulchan of Moshe and the left side in our picture, right? The amadidei. And it turns out that basically, if you add all of that up, it's more than 20 amot. Sorry, it's more than 10 amot, right? It turns out that the last shulchan is a half an amma into the darom. So if you get only 10 amot in order to place all the shulchanot, but you have 2.5 from the wall, plus one, plus 2.5 is 6, right? Plus one is 7, plus 2.5, and then basically you're at 9.5, and you have to put the third shulchan. But the third shulchan is an amma wide, and it's only supposed to be on the north side. So you don't have enough room to walk if you are going to squeeze these all into the north side. Answers the Gemara, well, you're right. That would be a problem if Moshe's shulchan was in the middle. But misavet shulchan de Moshe ba'adar aviyatvi lo the midile umanachle umitchile ledidei porta kitalmid hayoshev lifnei rabo. And in fact, you would basically take Moshe's shulchan and put it in front of them. And again, picture in Rashi, which is not correct because I don't know why, for some reason, this picture has Moshe's Shulchan in a different orientation than the other Shulchanot, which is incorrect, right? They're all the same. So I don't exactly understand why they did Rashi this way, but basically I would flip that top Shulchan in Rashi so that it's also going Mizrach Marav, if those are the directions. But that's the idea, right? I hope everyone has that picture in Rashi. That the idea basically is that the Shulchan of Moshe was not in between the two rows of Shulchanot, it was ahead of the two rows of Shulchanot. And so because you had Moshe's at the head, basically you had no problem walking in between because you didn't have to have three Shulchanot in a row. And it's like a student sitting in front of their Rabbo. Rashi actually adds a very interesting detail here, which is not necessary for this size thing, but Rashi says that in fact the Shulchan of Moshe was a little bit higher, so that the height was different. And that when we say a student, right, the teacher would sit at a higher point than the students, and so the Shulchan of Moshe was also higher than the other Shulchanot. Um, so that's an interesting point. But either way, the point is that there was room, and so the Shulchanot could either have been north-south or east-west, depending on the machloket of Rebbe and Rav Shimon. But either one would be acceptable as long as they were not in one row. So we will stop there. Hopefully these
So
pictures.
I don't know which Gemara you're using. The Steinsaltz doesn't really have any drawings, but Upscroll has several
I got it.
drawings.
Okay, yeah, I guess that is a problem, right? So I'm using the Vilna Shas, but yes,
Yeah.
there are many different versions, and again, I don't think Rashi's is correct, but I don't know. Hopefully the art school has correct drawings. I'm sure they
Upscroll flipped around the orientation to the way that you described it.
right. Well, because they should all be the same, right? It just doesn't make sense. Okay, everyone. So nice and confusing. We're going to learn more as the week goes on about what happened with all these tables, but more to come.
Yasher Koach, Shavua
Okay.
Tov.
Yeah. Shavua tov, everyone.
Thank you for getting up early.
You're welcome.
Are you
Thanks.
Amen.
flying
Have a
today?
good day. Yes.
Sorry?
You flying back today?
No, Monday, tomorrow.
Uh,
Enjoy.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye.
Enjoy.